World War II is usually remembered as a clash of armies and personalities, decisive battles, dramatic speeches, and moments that seemed to turn history overnight. Yet beneath that familiar story lies a quieter question. How did the Allies keep fighting at all year after year, when early victory was impossible and collapse was always near? This analysis explores how Canada, rarely at the center of headlines, became one of the key countries that sustained the Allied war effort over 6 long years, not through spectacle or dominance, but by making endurance itself possible. World War II is often remembered through its most dramatic moments: rapid invasions, collapsing fronts, and decisive battles that appeared to determine the fate of nations in a matter of weeks. Yet this emphasis on speed and spectacle can obscure a more fundamental reality. The Second World War was not won quickly, and it was not won solely on the battlefield. It became, above all, a war of endurance, one in which the capacity to sustain effort over years proved more decisive than early victories or tactical brilliance. Understanding why Canada mattered requires starting from this premise. By late 1939, the strategic problem facing the Allied powers was not how to defeat Germany swiftly, but how to survive long enough to make eventual victory possible. Britain, the last major European power still resisting after the fall of France in 1940, faced a prolonged struggle with limited manpower, constrained industrial capacity, and severe exposure to maritime disruption. The challenge was systemic rather than purely military: maintaining food supplies, financing production, protecting shipping lanes, and preserving social and political stability under continuous pressure. Without reliable external support, even battlefield success would have been strategically hollow. Canada's importance emerged precisely from this context. Unlike the major belligerents, Canada entered the war with a rare combination of advantages that were not immediately dramatic, but were structurally decisive. Geographically, it was distant from the primary theaters of combat, placing its territory beyond the reach of sustained enemy attack. This distance did not translate into detachment. Rather, it created security. Canadian infrastructure, ports, railways, factories, and agricultural systems could operate without interruption at a time when much of Europe could not. Politically, Canada possessed a stable parliamentary system and a mature administrative state capable of mobilization without authoritarian disruption. The declaration of war did not trigger internal collapse, emergency dictatorship, or institutional paralysis. Instead, it allowed for measured adaptation. Laws could be passed, agencies created, and resources redirected within an existing constitutional framework. This stability mattered because endurance is as much a political challenge as an economic one. Canada's position within the Commonwealth further amplified its relevance. It could act early in support of Britain while maintaining sufficient autonomy to adjust policies pragmatically as conditions evolved. In effect, Canada was neither a frontline state nor a distant bystander. It occupied an intermediate role, close enough to the conflict to be fully committed, yet far enough removed to function as a dependable base of support. There is a quiet irony here. Canada's greatest strategic contribution in the early years of the war did not come from dramatic action, but from the absence of disruption. Its factories kept running. Its ports stayed open. its institutions continued to function. In a war, defined by breakdowns and emergencies, reliability itself became a form of power. If endurance was the central strategic requirement of the Second World War, then economic transformation was the mechanism through which that endurance was made possible. For Canada, the challenge between 1940 and 1942 was not simply to increase production, but to reorganize an entire national economy so that it could operate under sustained wartime conditions without exhausting itself or undermining social stability. This transformation was gradual, deliberate, and institutional, rather than improvised. Canada entered the war without a massive standing armaments industry. Its pre-war economy was oriented toward agriculture, resource extraction, and limited manufacturing, much of it tied to civilian markets. The task, therefore, was not to repurpose an existing war machine, but to build one while the war was already underway. This required coordination on a scale Canada had never previously attempted. The federal government responded by expanding its role as planner and regulator, while stopping short of full nationalization. Instead of dismantling private enterprise, it reorganized it. A central feature of this process was the creation of crown corporations and coordinating agencies designed to manage contracts, allocate raw materials, and set production priorities. These institutions acted as intermediaries between state objectives and private capacity. The result was a hybrid system. Private firms produced goods, but within a framework of public oversight that minimized duplication, reduced competition for scarce resources, and ensured continuity. This structure proved particularly well suited to a long war, as it balanced efficiency with flexibility. Canada's industrial geography also played a critical role. Production was dispersed across multiple regions, rather than concentrated in a few vulnerable centers. Shipyards on both coasts, aircraft factories in central Canada, and munitions plants inland created redundancy within the system. If one facility slowed or failed, others could compensate. In strategic terms, this reduced the risk of catastrophic disruption, an essential condition for sustained output over years rather than months. Equally important was the nature of what Canada chose to produce. Rather than focusing on experimental or prestige projects, Canadian industry emphasized reliability and volume. Standardized equipment, transport vessels, and training aircraft could be produced consistently and maintained easily. This approach may have lacked dramatic appeal, but it aligned closely with the broader Allied need for predictable supply chains. In coalition warfare, consistency often matters more than innovation. There is a subtle irony in this economic transformation. Canada became indispensable not by attempting to rival the industrial scale of the United States, but by positioning itself as a dependable secondary engine of production, large enough to matter, stable enough to trust, and flexible enough to adapt. By 1942, Canada had effectively converted economic potential into sustained output, laying the material foundation for the later phases of the war. Industrial output alone could not sustain the Allied war effort unless goods, fuel, and personnel could be moved reliably across vast distances. Between 1941 and 1943, the Atlantic Ocean became the most critical and most dangerous logistical corridor of the war. It was here that Canada's role expanded from that of a producer to that of a logistical anchor, helping to stabilize a system under constant pressure rather than seeking decisive, dramatic victories at sea. The Battle of the Atlantic is often described in terms of ship losses and submarine encounters, but at its core, it was a systems conflict. The central question was not whether individual convoys could survive, but whether the overall flow of shipping could be maintained at a level sufficient to support Britain and, later, Allied forces preparing for operations in Europe. Disruption, even without total collapse, threatened to undermine industrial production by creating bottlenecks, shortages, and uncertainty. Sustaining the system required scale, coordination, and endurance. Canada's geographic position made it indispensable to this effort. As the western terminus of the Atlantic crossing, Canadian ports became critical nodes in convoy assembly, repair, and turnaround. Halifax, St. John, and later ports along the St. Lawrence handled increasing volumes of cargo, often under conditions of severe strain. Canada invested heavily in port infrastructure, storage facilities, and transport links, ensuring that ships could be loaded, repaired, and returned to service with minimal delay. Speed of turnaround, rather than the sheer number of ships, became a key metric of success. Naval expansion was equally important, but it followed a pragmatic logic. Canada did not seek to dominate the Atlantic. Instead, it focused on escort capacity, training, and integration into a broader Allied command structure. Escort vessels were produced rapidly, crews were trained continuously, and procedures were standardized to reduce friction between multinational forces. The emphasis was on coverage and continuity rather than tactical brilliance. In a prolonged maritime campaign, preventing failure mattered more than achieving spectacular success. Training and institutional learning also proved decisive. Early shortcomings, limited experience, uneven equipment, and coordination challenges were addressed through systematic adaptation rather than abrupt reform. Canadian naval and maritime institutions evolved in real time, absorbing lessons and refining practices as the conflict continued. This incremental improvement contributed to a steady reduction in losses and a corresponding increase in reliability. There is a quiet measure of success embedded in this story. Many of Canada's most important Atlantic contributions are difficult to quantify precisely because they involved outcomes that did not occur. Convoys that were not destroyed, supplies that arrived on schedule, industrial rhythms that were not interrupted. In a war defined by visible catastrophe, such absences were strategically significant. Sustaining a long war required not only material resources and secure supply lines, but also a continuous flow of trained personnel. For the Allied powers, the challenge was not simply recruiting large numbers of individuals, but transforming them into effective operators, pilots, technicians, navigators, and specialists, without exhausting national populations or undermining domestic stability. Canada played a central role in meeting this challenge by functioning as a scalable training and manpower platform throughout much of the war. Canada's suitability for this role was largely structural. Its vast territory, low population density, and distance from enemy attack provided a secure environment in which large-scale training programs could operate without disruption. Airfields, classrooms, workshops, and testing ranges could be constructed and expanded without fear of bombardment or invasion. This security allowed training to proceed methodically rather than under crisis conditions, a critical advantage in a conflict that demanded consistency over time. The emphasis placed on training reflected a strategic calculation. Poorly trained personnel impose hidden costs, higher accident rates, inefficient use of equipment, and increased strain on replacement systems. Canada's contribution lay in mitigating these costs. Training programs were designed to be standardized and repeatable, ensuring that graduates met predictable levels of competence. This standardization facilitated integration into multinational forces, reducing friction when personnel were deployed abroad. Manpower management was treated as a long-term planning problem rather than a short-term mobilization surge. Canada balanced recruitment with careful consideration of industrial and agricultural labor needs at home. This approach limited social dislocation and preserved the productive base necessary for sustained war output. The result was not maximal extraction of manpower, but controlled utilization, an approach better suited to a conflict measured in years rather than months. Rotation and specialization further reinforced endurance. Individuals were trained for specific roles rather than being treated as interchangeable units. This specialization improved efficiency while allowing for more effective replacement systems. When losses occurred, trained personnel could be inserted into existing structures without extensive retraining. The system emphasized continuity over improvisation. It is important to clarify the nature of this contribution. Canada's significance did not lie primarily in the number of combat troops deployed at any single moment, but in its ability to sustain Allied human capital over time. Training capacity functioned as a multiplier. It enhanced the effectiveness of equipment, reduced operational inefficiencies, and stabilized force structures across multiple theaters. A subtle irony emerges from this role. Training, by its nature, produces no immediate spectacle. Its successes are measured in smooth operations and reduced errors rather than visible triumphs. Yet, in a war of endurance, these understated outcomes prove strategically decisive. As the Second World War progressed into its later phases, the primary challenge facing the Allied powers was no longer survival, but coordination. By 1942, the coalition opposing the Axis had grown in scale and complexity, encompassing states with different strategic cultures, military doctrines, and economic priorities. Victory depended not merely on accumulating power, but on ensuring that this power could be directed coherently over time. Canada played a significant, if often understated, role in making this coordination possible. Coalition warfare is inherently fragile. Divergent national interests, uneven burdens, and institutional incompatibilities can generate friction that slows decision-making and wastes resources. Canada's position within the Allied system helped mitigate these risks. It shared political traditions, legal norms, and administrative practices with Britain, while maintaining close economic and geographic ties to the United States. This dual alignment allowed Canada to function as an intermediary, less dominant than the great powers, but sufficiently embedded to facilitate cooperation. Institutionally, Canada contributed to standardization and planning processes that reduced operational friction. Production specifications, training standards, and logistical procedures were aligned in ways that allowed equipment, personnel, and supplies to move across national boundaries with minimal adjustment. This was not a glamorous task, but it was a necessary one. In large coalitions, incompatibility is a form of inefficiency, and inefficiency is cumulative over time. Canada's administrative credibility further enhanced its role. Having demonstrated reliability in production, logistics, and training, Canadian agencies and officers were regarded as competent partners rather than symbolic contributors. This reputation mattered. Trust is a strategic asset in coalition warfare, enabling delegation and reducing the need for constant oversight. Canada's influence often flowed from this trust, rather than from formal authority. There is an important distinction to be made here. Canada did not dictate Allied strategy, nor did it attempt to position itself as a major decision-maker. Instead, it contributed by ensuring that agreed strategies could be executed smoothly. This distinction reflects a broader truth about sustained warfare. Execution failures can undermine even the most sophisticated plans. By helping to maintain institutional continuity and administrative coherence, Canada reduced the risk of such failures. A subtle irony emerges once again. Canada's influence was greatest when it was least visible. Effective coordination tends to erase its own traces. When systems function smoothly, the mechanisms behind them fade into the background, yet, without this connective tissue, the Allied war effort would have been slower, less efficient, and more vulnerable to internal strain. By 1945, the Allied victory in the Second World War was no longer in doubt. Yet the significance of Canada's wartime role did not end with the cessation of hostilities. The structures, habits, and expectations created through 6 years of sustained contribution reshaped Canada's position in the international system. This transformation did not result from dramatic battlefield dominance, but from the cumulative effects of reliability, institutional capacity, and long-term engagement. Canada emerged from the war with an expanded administrative state and a proven ability to manage complex national programs. Wartime coordination between government, industry, and civil society had demonstrated that large-scale planning could be undertaken without undermining democratic governance. This experience translated directly into post-war policymaking, where Canada possessed both the confidence and the institutional tools to engage in reconstruction, international cooperation, and economic management. The war had served as a rigorous test of governance under pressure, and Canada had passed it. Economically, sustained wartime production accelerated industrial development and diversification. Industries that had expanded to meet wartime demand did not simply disappear after 1945. Instead, they became part of a broader economic base that supported growth, employment, and technological capacity in the post-war period. Canada's economy emerged more integrated, more complex, and more capable of supporting international commitments than it had been in 1939. Diplomatically, Canada's wartime behavior established a reputation for dependability rather than ambition. This reputation proved advantageous in the emerging post-war order. Canada was neither viewed as a disruptive power nor as a passive one. Its record of consistent contribution positioned it as a credible participant in multilateral institutions and collective security arrangements. Influence flowed not from coercion, but from demonstrated competence and restraint. The concept of Canada as a middle power is often associated with the post-war era, but its foundations were laid during the war itself. Sustaining the Allied effort required skills that would later become central to Canada's international identity: mediation, administration, standardization, and long-term planning. These were not accidental byproducts of victory. They were direct extensions of wartime experience. There is a final irony worth noting. Popular memory often privileges moments of crisis and heroism, yet Canada's lasting impact arose from continuity rather than crisis. Its contribution was cumulative rather than decisive in any single instance. In a war defined by destruction and disruption, Canada's strategic value lay in its ability to keep systems functioning over time. Understanding this role clarifies a broader lesson about modern warfare. Wars of scale are rarely won by spectacle alone. They are sustained and ultimately decided by states capable of endurance, coordination, and institutional resilience. Canada's experience in the Second World War illustrates how such capacities can shape not only the outcome of a conflict, but the trajectory of a nation long after the fighting ends. If you found this analysis useful, consider following along, leaving a comment, or continuing to the next examination of how endurance reshaped modern warfare.